It was one of those raw winter mornings where the air felt sharp enough to bite. The city hadn't fully woken yet, but the streets already buzzed with hurried footsteps and the low hum of traffic. In a small corner cafe, the kind with fogged-up windows and the faint smell of fresh bread, 13-year-old Emma sat at the counter, nursing a chipped mug of hot chocolate. She was tiny for her age, with a faded blue coat 2 sizes too big and mittens that had lost their pair. Her hair was tied into a messy braid that she'd done herself, and her schoolbag sat at her feet, slightly torn along the seams. She wasn't there because she had money to spare, in fact, she barely had any at all. She was there because the cafe owner, Mrs. Patel, sometimes let her sit in the corner before school to warm up, especially on days when the apartment heat wasn't working. Emma's life had been like that for as long as she could remember. A series of people quietly helping, strangers stepping in, and her mother doing her best to stretch every dollar until it almost tore. Her mother, Claire, was a seamstress. She worked late hours at a little alterations shop, sewing hems and patching zippers, never complaining, even when her hands ached and her eyes stung. Emma had learned early that her job as a daughter was to help however she could, washing dishes, keeping her grades up, and never, ever asking for more than they could give. That morning, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than their monthly rent. His presence seemed to change the air in the room, like he wasn't used to waiting for anything, yet carried himself with quiet command. Emma didn't know who he was. She didn't read the business magazines that sometimes featured his name, and she didn't watch the financial news. But anyone looking closely could tell this man was someone important. He walked to the counter, ordered a black coffee, and reached into his coat, only to pause. A faint crease appeared between his brows. He patted his pockets, checked his wallet, and muttered something under his breath. Mrs. Patel smiled politely, waiting, but there was a small awkward silence. "I must have left my card in my other coat," he said finally, his voice low but tinged with the discomfort of someone not used to being caught unprepared. Emma didn't think about it for long. She slid off her stool, reached into her schoolbag, and pulled out a few crumpled bills, money she'd saved from doing errands for their neighbor, Mr. Grant. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a coffee. "I can get it," she said simply, holding the money out toward Mrs. Patel. The man turned to look at her, startled. "That's not necessary," he began. "It's okay," Emma replied, her voice small but firm. "You can pay me back someday." Mrs. Patel took the money and handed him his coffee. The man accepted it slowly, still watching her as though trying to figure her out. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "What's your name?" "Emma." He nodded, almost like the name hit something deep inside him, though she didn't notice. "Well, Emma. I won't forget this." She smiled faintly, then turned back to her hot chocolate. She didn't think much of it, just another moment where kindness was the easiest choice. Later that afternoon, in his office high above the city, Nicholas Turner, billionaire real estate mogul, sat at his desk, distracted. He'd thought about the girl all day. Something about her face, the way her braid swung slightly as she moved, the way she had spoken without hesitation, it stirred a memory he'd buried years ago. 14 years ago, he had been a very different man, reckless, ambitious, and unwilling to slow down for anyone. Claire had been the one person who saw through all that, who loved him for who he was rather than what he could become. But when she told him she was pregnant, fear had gripped him like a vice. He had made the worst choice of his life. He walked away, convincing himself it was better for both of them. He had regretted it ever since. Over the years, he had tried to find her, but the city was large, and Claire had disappeared into its folds. He told himself that if fate wanted to give him another chance, it would. And that morning, he realized, maybe it just had. The next day, Nicholas returned to the cafe. He asked Mrs. Patel about Emma, but all she would say was, "She comes in before school. Sweet girl. Helps her mom a lot." Nicholas waited. Sure enough, the bell chimed and Emma walked in, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked surprised to see him, but not uncomfortable. "I came to pay you back," he said, sliding a crisp 20 across the counter. "That's too much," Emma said, pushing it back. "Call it interest," he replied. She hesitated, then tucked it into her bag. "Thanks." Nicholas could have left it there. But something in him, maybe guilt, maybe hope, kept him coming back. Each morning, he'd be at the cafe before she arrived. They'd talk about small things, her favorite subjects in school, how she liked to read mystery books, how she sometimes helped her mom sew. The more she spoke, the more Nicholas's certainty grew. The shape of her smile, the determination in her voice, they were pieces of himself he had never seen reflected in anyone else. Finally, after 2 weeks, he asked gently, "What does your mom do?" "She sews clothes for people," Emma said proudly. "She works really hard. She's the best person in the world." Nicholas's throat tightened. "And your dad?" Emma shrugged. "It's just me and Mom. Always has been." That night, Nicholas didn't sleep. He dug through old records, called in favors, and by morning, he knew for sure, Emma was his daughter. The revelation hit him like a storm. All the years he'd missed. The birthdays he hadn't celebrated. The scraped knees he hadn't bandaged. The lullabies he hadn't sung. But he couldn't just walk in and announce it, not without hurting her, not without earning the right to be part of her life. So he started small. Groceries quietly delivered to their building. An anonymous donor covering Emma's school lunch program. A scholarship fund set up in her name, though she wouldn't know about it until later. And every morning, the coffee. Always the coffee, shared in that small cafe where their story had begun. It was a month later when Emma's mother finally came into the cafe. Nicholas froze when he saw her. Claire looked exactly as he remembered, older, yes, and more tired, but still with that same quiet strength in her eyes. She stopped short when she saw him, her face shifting from surprise to guarded distance. "Nicholas," she said carefully. "Claire." His voice was rough. I didn't plan for this." She glanced at Emma, who was busy talking to Mrs. Patel, then back at him. "She doesn't know." "I know," he said softly. I want to make things right." Claire's eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "It's been 13 years. You can't just walk back in." "I'm not asking to." "Not yet. I just want to be around. To help." Claire studied him for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. "She paid for your coffee, didn't she?" Nicholas smiled faintly. "Yeah. And it was the best coffee I've ever had." Weeks turned into months. Nicholas kept showing up, not as a billionaire, not as a man with regrets, but simply as someone who cared. He helped Emma with her homework, taught her chess, listened when she talked about her dreams. And one morning, as they sat in the cafe, Emma looked at him and said, "You know, you're kind of like a dad." Nicholas's breath caught. "Yeah." She nodded. "If I ever had one, I'd want him to be like you." He couldn't speak for a moment. Then he reached across the table, covering her small hand with his. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. And in that moment, Nicholas knew, the little girl who had once paid for his coffee had given him something far greater in return, a second change.